Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am an addictions physician working out of Toronto, Canada. Today, I'm going to talk about intermittent fasting. This is part of the talk that I often include when I talk about food addiction. Intermittent fasting is a very popular practice used today. You can find it on the internet, often in the context of weight loss, although, of course, there are some medical advantages. This talk is going to be looking at what it is, some of the pros about it, why it is that so many physicians do recommend it, the cons, what are some of the concerns that I have about it, especially as it relates to food addiction, and then a summary recommendation. I don't say don't do intermittent fasting, but I do say use it with caution. So first of all, what does intermittent fasting mean? Fasting means you're not eating. Sometimes people will say, okay, we're not eating food, but we can still have water with salt in it and maybe a bit of MTC oil. But for the most part, people mean generally you're not eating anything, certainly not snacking or having a little bit of something to get you through the hours that you're not eating. And those fasts can be anything from a number of hours in a day to actually days long. Common one, sometimes people will not eat for one day and then fast for one whole day. So for 24 hours, they're not eating at all. Another quite common one is fast for 3 days. There are even some fasts that are recommended for 1 month. Now, those are almost always medically supervised, and they're used for things like trying to make a cancer regress or somebody who's got very serious metabolic syndrome. Another type of intermittent fasting that's called alternate day fast. You have a regular day where you eat, I guess, as much as you like, as much as you normally would. On an alternative day, you have a very low amount of food, maybe as low as 400 or 600 calories. The most common type of intermittent fasting that we talk about now are where you eat every day, but within what are called time-restricted windows. And sometimes people will call intermittent fasting time-restricted eating. Even people who don't use intermittent fasting will use the 12 and 12, which means you eat for 12 hours. That might be from 8 in the morning until 8 at night, and then you don't eat from 8 at night until 8 in the morning. That's actually recommended almost across the board because there is that concept that we want to have a period of time where the digestive system is able to digest and is not overly stimulated by new foods that are being entered, especially because when people are eating after 8 o'clock, they're not eating meals, they're eating snacks, and they're often eating snacks that are high sugary, high fat, high salt, and those are very stimulating. The whole point about the digestive system, it belongs to the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest system. So you don't want to be overly stimulated. You want to have that time to properly digest your food. Probably the two most common forms of intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating are where a person will eat only 8 hours in the day and not eat 16 hours of the day, as opposed to 12. They're not eating for 16 hours of the day. So that might mean from 9 in the morning until 5 at night. They're eating 2 meals a day typically, no snacking. The second most common one, where you're eating only a 6-hour window or a 4-hour window period. So that might be from 12 until 4 or 10 until 4, and then no eating from 4 o'clock all the way into the night, into the morning until 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes that's called 1 meal a day. That's typically what's meant by intermittent fasting. Why would you do time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting or the prolonged fasting, not the intermittent, but the prolonged fasting? There's been a fair amount of research, no question about it, that it does reduce blood sugar. So if you have a problem with diabetes or metabolic syndrome, your medical health will respond quite quickly. So it's a very quick, effective way to treat diabetes. It will reduce the blood sugar, it will reduce the insulin surges, because if you're not eating, then there's no need for insulin, so you don't have those surges. And if you're only eating once or twice a day, you have a minor surge at the time of eating, and then the rest of the day, a flattened insulin response, which is perfect because insulin resistance develops when there's too much insulin that the body is expected to cope with. So it does give you a quick resolution for metabolic syndrome. It also seems to reduce inflammatory markers so that if you're full of pain because you have osteoarthritis, it will actually increase neurotropic factor in the brain, which means that you potentially can get a little bit more alert, a little bit smarter. And a lot of people will say that intermittent fasting has kind of made them more on the ball. So that's an advantage. And it seems to slow the aging process down. There's been some research to show that just reduced calories will slow the aging process down. But intermittent fasting seems to do that as well. Probably that has to do with the reduction of insulin that's required from the body. They're pretty strong pros. So how is it that intermittent fasting works? Our brain requires fuel. It requires oxygen. I need to breathe in order to have my brain work. We also need glucose. Those are the two essential things that the brain needs just to be alive. Glucose is essential. Glucose is fuel for the brain. And so when glucose is not available, a person becomes hypoglycemic. They become dizzy, they become agitated, they become craving for food, especially sugar, because sugar is glucose and the brain is saying, I need that fuel. So we do have a backup system that if I'm not able to eat my glucose, which I get through carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, will eventually break down into glucose and will give me that fuel that I need. But if I'm eating a low carbohydrate diet, not just a no sugar diet, but a low carbohydrate or no carbohydrate diet, otherwise known as the keto plan or carnivore plan, then I'm not getting that glucose that I need. Actually, the body has prepared us for this. This is from the perspective of evolutionary-wise hunters and gatherers. There were times when we were hunting deer or elk or rabbits or whatever it was that we were hunting in the wild and gathering, the berries and the apples that we could find. But in the wintertime, there weren't any apples and berries and grains. There wasn't anything like that. So we were only reliant on what we could hunt. There is another backup system when there are no carbohydrates, either intentional or because of nature, because of the circumstances. We have a backup system that's called ketones. And what that means is that when I don't get fuel from my carbohydrates, which the brain prefers, then I can get fuel from my fats and my proteins. First of all, that will be the fats and proteins that I eat. And if I'm not eating anything at all because I'm literally starving, like fasting in that month-long practice, or just literally starving, then I'm going to eventually start eating my own fat and my own protein, which is of course not a good idea and will eventually lead to my death, which is why a prolonged fast of more than a month, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, you'll eventually. When I'm eating fats and proteins, I'm not getting glucose because it's not a carbohydrate. I'm getting ketones. It's a secondary backup source that the brain has. It will prefer the glucose, the carbohydrate source first, but eventually, after a few days, it could be 3 days, it could be 5 days, you will become what the keto world calls fat adapted. It's almost as if the brain realizes, oh, there's no more glucose and I'm going to die because I'm not getting fuel to my brain. Well, then can I use the ketone backup system, which is the fats and the proteins? And if I'm eating them because I'm eating a keto or carnivore diet, there they are. And if I'm not eating them, it's me, it's my body. I'll start eating my body, essentially getting fuel from my own muscles and proteins. People who use the ketone system, that's the keto diet and the carnivore diet, will say, hey, all of those benefits that I just mentioned a few minutes ago come to me and I feel smarter and I feel more alert and I don't have those ups and downs of crashes. I'm going to choose this as a lifestyle. That's why a person would use the keto diet. But intermittent fasting is a way of achieving some of that, because if you fast on a regular basis for enough time, you may not become keto adapted, but your body almost trains itself into using more fats and proteins because you don't have as many carbohydrates on board in that time restricted window period. And if you're eating a low carb time restricted window period, which is what most people who do intermittent fasting are doing, you will become not completely fat adapted, but quite well, certainly enough to get a lot of those advantages that I talked about. Relying on this ketone backup, which intermittent fasting opens the door to, gives you a lot of those interventions. So why would I say, I'm just giving you all of the benefits of this, and why would I say use it with caution? Well, I wouldn't say don't use it, because obviously there are benefits and I can't quarrel with those benefits. I absolutely can't. Here's where I have some concerns. For people who are food addicted, they don't have a normal brain. They don't have a normal body anymore. They already have a hyper reaction to foods, to psychologically and also physically, to foods that they put into their mouth. So first I'm going to start with eating disorders. There's been some concerns mentioned about intermittent fasting. For one thing, it does encourage anorexic behavior. okay, I'm going to eat very restricted food and within a very restricted time, like maybe just once a day, and I'm not going to eat the rest of the day. Well, if you have a history of anorexia, it can actually foster or feed, I think even more than that, binge eating disorder can be encouraged. Because often what happens is when the person has what we call the refeeding window, that 4-hour or 8-hour period where you get to eat, they've been hungry the whole day, and so now it's their time to eat. Probably think, well, I haven't eaten that 16 hours, so therefore that's all those calories that are saved if I'm trying to lose weight, but now I can really eat as much as I want. Or people will eat as much as they want and slap their hand and say, well, now I'm not going to eat for another day, and they'll call it intermittent fasting. This is not good because it fosters this restricting and then overeating behavior that happens in eating disorders. As a result, a person can be showing signs of anorexia and binge eating disorder, and it's masked because the person just says, I'm intermittent fasting. So similar to my concerns about eating disorders, I have concerns with the food addict. Remember, what's happening with food addiction is the person is now hypersensitive. They have a little bit of a carbohydrate. Sometimes it doesn't even have to be a carbohydrate, any food, because you can eventually become addicted to any food, and you can become addicted to eating behavior. I just need to feel that feeling of eating and getting full. That's enough that can actually drive a person to addictive behavior, not in the early days, but in later stages. And typically what happens is that person who's hypersensitive in this way has developed that over a long period of time, and often in their history, they've had a lot of periods of restricting and eating, that restricting and binge behavior that is also common with binge eating disorder. They become hypersensitive not only to the effects of the food, but also to the negative effects, the withdrawal of the not food. And hunger is a cue, it's a trigger to eat. It's the same as the opiate addict who, when they stop using their opiate, they start to go into withdrawal. That little bit of a flu is a warning that there is worse ahead. And if I don't get my drug, in 2 to 3 to 4 hours, I'm going to be even sicker. And in 8 hours, I'm going to be on the toilet vomiting. Similarly, with the food addict, just a little bit of hunger has already ingrained in them the warning that this means I'm going to be pacing the floor tonight. I'm going to be wanting to eat food. I won't be able to go to sleep and go to work in the morning. I better eat something. So hunger itself can become a big trigger to overeating. Now, you can, if you do intermittent fasting properly, which means using a lot of protein and a lot of fat, prolong the period of time of not feeling hungry, because proteins and fats don't make you as hungry as carbohydrates. Carbohydrate, it goes in quickly, especially if they're refined, and then goes out quickly, whereas proteins and fats are a steady level of energy of the ketones, which will last like 4 to 6 to 8, sometimes 10 hours of not being hungry. I mean, you could eat if you thought about it, but it's not like you've got that hunger feeling and I'm going to go crazy if I don't eat. The other thing is that if you're hungry, the body kicks into a stress response. A stress response means that the brain on some level registers there's danger, there's no food in the environment. That's not good. I'm going to become hyper alert, hyper vigilant for food, just because of the stress response. And when I notice the foods that you're eating, I'm going to have an extra anticipation, like there's a little burst of dopamine that happens with hunger and the stress response, where when you're stressed, you want to eat more because you think you need more energy, and the food is more enticing. And interestingly enough, the other thing that happens is if you're hungry for long enough, because it's a stress response, and what happens with the stress response, the body has a compensatory endorphin response. I'm in stress, that means my body's in danger, and that means I've got to run or fight, and my endorphins, which are my natural pain relievers, are there to help me get through that stressful response. So I get a little burst of endorphins, which make me feel good and strong and less in pain. I actually think this might be partly why people who engage in anorexic behavior but are actually not anorexics do that, because hunger will actually give a compensatory good feeling even in the pain. It's a feeling of, I feel stronger and better. It's, yes, the ketones are involved, but the endorphins are also involved. The food addict, any way that you get an extra neurochemical boost, either through dopamine or serotonin or endorphin, that's not good, because the food addict wants that and it will chase for that. You want to be careful and use these neurochemicals where they belong to our advantage. Because of these cons, I worry about food addicts picking up this tool that's called intermittent fasting. Generally speaking, we would say with intermittent fasting, it's not recommended when a person has a dual diagnosis. If you have a dual diagnosis of eating disorder, avoid it. And if you think that you might have a food addiction, unfortunately, food addiction is not yet a medical diagnosed condition. But I'm just going to say, if you think you have a problem with food addiction, then I would suggest it should be used very cautiously. Absolutely say in early recovery of food addiction, be very careful. I would say don't. If you don't want to play with fire, don't do the intermittent fasting. You might be able to use it once you're in food addiction recovery after a prolonged period of time. Here's an interesting thing. Many of the goals that you want to get with intermittent fasting, like weight loss, like removal of cravings, like all of those medical conditions that often people use, can be achieved without fasting. I actually think it's fine to do a 12 and 12 and maybe even a 16 and 8, but anything more than that, once a day or every other day, or those prolonged fasts, they're not necessary. Just change your food plan. Just reduce the refined carbohydrates that you're eating, certainly the sugars, and you'll get a lot of the same benefits without the potential dangers. The other thing that can happen too, what we don't talk about often, but is true, it can backfire. You can actually regain weight or not lose weight. And after a period of time of weight loss, people will often lose weight in intermittent fasting. They stall and then they're stuck and it doesn't get any better, and sometimes even starts to creep up. So it's a short-term weight solution, but it's actually not really a long-term weight solution. And one of the reasons why it's not is because a lot of times people will eat their meals in such a way that it doesn't actually benefit weight. If you want to do intermittent fasting and ensure weight loss, actually you should move your window period of eating earlier in the day. For example, 12 to 4 or 10 until 2, not 5 until 9. I've seen people do that, and that's almost defeating the purpose. In conclusion, intermittent fasting, I think, is a great medical intervention. It should not be used for weight loss unless the person is morbidly obese, preferably somebody who understands food addiction as well and binge eating disorder. What the medical person wants to do is make sure that that fasting is not an addictive behavior and that it's not being used, intermittent fasting, as a way to binge on foods and then kind of punish yourself later by not eating for a long period of time. And that it's not used for weight loss alone, but you don't know all of the pitfalls you're going to fall into. That's my take on intermittent fasting. Thank you.